The 38 Special Snub Nose is weaker than a 9mm compact. It holds fewer rounds. It recoils harder per ounce of gun. Its trigger is worse. On paper, it loses every meaningful comparison. The internet hate is technically accurate, and that is exactly why the hate is wrong. Because the snub nose is not judged on what it actually is, it is judged on a test it was never built to pass. The real question is not whether the 38 Special is powerful enough. It is whether being less powerful is the same thing as being wrong. It is not. Go to any gun forum, any Reddit thread, any YouTube comment section where someone posts a picture of a snub-nosed 38 and asks if it's a viable carry option. The responses arrive like clockwork, almost choreographed. Boomer gun. Get a 9. Why would you carry that when a Glock 43 exists? My grandpa carried one of those. Just get a 9. The dismissiveness is casual, almost bored, like explaining to someone that fax machines are no longer a thing. The 38 Snub Nose has become the firearm equivalent of a flip phone. People don't just dislike it. They're genuinely puzzled about why it's still in the conversation at all. I understand that reaction. I really do. The numbers are not on the Snub Nose's side, and I'm not going to pretend they are. A typical 38 Special Plus P load, something like a 158 grain lead semi-wad cutter hollow point, produces somewhere around 150 to 200 foot-pounds of energy from a 2-inch barrel, depending on the specific load and the specific gun. Some loads push a little higher, most don't. Now take a modern 9mm JHP, something like a 124 grain gold dot, or HST, from a 3-inch barrel. And you're sitting in the 300 to 380 foot-pound range, depending on the load. That is not a marginal gap. That is not something you paper over with clever bullet design or anecdotal stopping power stories. Think about what that difference actually means. 200 foot-pounds of energy is enough to cause serious damage. 350 foot-pounds causes a different kind of damage entirely. Deeper penetration, wider temporary cavitation, more tissue disruption on the way through. That is roughly the difference between being hit with a framing hammer and being shoved hard against a wall. Both might end a fight. One is clearly, obviously, more decisive. Nobody who has shot both cartridges would argue otherwise. So the hate earned its paycheck. On paper, in gelatin, on a range with a sandbag rest, the 9mm compact wins this comparison, and it is not a close fight. The snub nose is slower to reload, harder to shoot accurately, and delivers substantially less energy on target. Every piece of internet mockery has a real number sitting behind it. I have no interest in telling you those numbers are wrong. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. We keep testing what the bullet does in ballistic gelatin. We almost never test what a person can actually do with the gun when everything goes wrong. And once you start looking at it from that angle, the whole comparison starts to shift underneath you in a way that makes both sides uncomfortable. Because if the snub nose is this bad, if it loses this badly on paper, then it should lose even worse when we look closer. That's how it usually works. The deeper you dig into a weak option, the worse it looks. But that's not what happens here. The deeper you dig, the more the test itself starts to look like the wrong test. Take velocity loss. This is where the hate gets louder, not quieter. Ammunition manufacturers test and rate their 38 Special loads in 4-inch test barrels. Most snub noses have 2-inch barrels. Some are even shorter. That 2-inch difference matters more than almost anyone realizes. A 38 Special load that produces 890 feet per second on the box might only produce 650 to 700 from a 2-inch snub. You're losing 200 feet per second or more to barrel length alone. The barrel isn't just short, it's actively stealing from you. Now compare that to 9mm. A 9mm round, rated at 1200 feet per second from a 4-inch barrel, might drop to 1100 or 1050 from a 3-inch compact barrel. It loses something, sure, but proportionally, the 38 Special loses far more of its rated performance. The gap between the two cartridges actually widens in the real world compared to what the boxes suggest. You don't just lose velocity, you lose the performance you thought you paid for. The hate just got another piece of evidence. So why did millions of cops and civilians carry this thing for the better part of a century? They weren't stupid. They just didn't have what we have now. When the snub nose was the dominant concealed carry gun in American law enforcement and civilian life, the alternative to a J-frame wasn't a Glock 43. It wasn't a SIG P365. The alternative was nothing reliable in a semi-auto at that size. The snub nose wasn't chosen because it was perfect. It was chosen because the competition at that footprint basically didn't exist. It was the best available pocket gun, not the best possible one. And once that historical context gets stripped away in internet arguments, the snub nose looks like a deliberate choice to carry something weak. It wasn't. It was a compromise made because the better option hadn't been invented yet. The FBI and most major departments transitioned to semi-autos through the late 1980s and 1990s, not because revolvers suddenly stopped working, but because semi-autos finally got small enough and reliable enough to offer a real alternative. The snub nose didn't get worse. The world around it got better. The snub nose didn't become a bad gun. The alternatives just became good enough to expose what it always was, a compromise. Now let's talk about capacity, because this is where the snub nose takes its most visible beating. 5 rounds, maybe 6, in an older K-frame snub, against 10 to 15 rounds in a modern Micro 9. On its face, this looks devastating. 3 times the ammunition. But I think capacity is the most poorly understood variable in the entire defensive handgun conversation. Documented civilian defensive incidents across multiple databases and analyses from different sources consistently suggest that most encounters involve 2 or 3 shots fired. Sometimes fewer. The exact numbers vary by source and methodology, and I'm not going to treat any single database as gospel, but the direction is consistent. This doesn't mean capacity doesn't matter. It means capacity doesn't matter the way people think it matters. It's not about how many rounds the average fight requires. It's about margin. Margin for misses. Margin for a threat that doesn't stop. Margin for the worst night of your life instead of the statistical average. And 5 rounds gives you a thinner margin than anyone should be comfortable accepting. 2 misses under stress, and you've got 3 rounds left. That is not a comfortable number when your heart rate is north of 180 and your hands aren't doing what you trained them to do, so the hate keeps scoring. Less energy, worse velocity retention, less capacity, slower reloads, heavier trigger. If we stopped right here, this would be a eulogy. But we've been testing which gun is better on a sheet of paper. We haven't tested which one you can actually get into action when your life is on the line. And that test changes things. If you're tired of gear reviews that read like press releases and arguments that read like fanboy wars, that's kind of why this channel exists. Now back to it. Think about how a gun actually gets used in a real defensive situation. Not on a square range. Not from a holster on your hip with your hands already in position and your heart rate at rest. Think about the environments where people actually carry snub noses. A coat pocket in winter, an ankle holster under a pant leg, a small bag, a deep appendix position where a larger gun prints and announces itself to everyone around you. The snub nose was not designed to be drawn like a service pistol. It was designed to be grabbed and fired. And that distinction sounds minor until you understand how much of modern defensive handgun training assumes you have 2 hands, a proper holster, and enough space to draw cleanly. The snub nose was built for people who don't have those things. And this is where the comparison flips in a way that almost nobody on either side talks about, honestly. A semi-auto in a tight pocket is a genuine problem. Fabric catches on the slide. The slide can be pushed out of battery if the gun is pressed against your body or your clothing during the draw. You might need 2 hands to rack it if it doesn't feed properly on that first desperate grab. Under extreme stress, your fine motor skills are the first thing to degrade. This isn't theory. It's well-documented physiology. Manipulating a slide stop, racking a slide, seating a magazine, these are all fine motor tasks. They work great on a Tuesday afternoon at the range when you're calm and focused. They become significantly less reliable when someone is trying to hurt you and your sympathetic nervous system is running the show. The snub nose doesn't care about any of that. There's no slide to rack. There's no safety to forget. There's no magazine that didn't get seated fully because you were rushing. You grab the grip, you pull the trigger, the gun fires. That's it. That's the entire manual of arms. It is gross motor. It is as simple as a mechanical tool can be. It works from inside a pocket. It works if it's pressed against an attacker's body. It works if you're on the ground and your other hand is occupied. Limp wristing doesn't exist in a revolver. A slide being pushed out of battery doesn't exist in a revolver. The gun doesn't care how you hold it. It doesn't care if you're clumsy. It doesn't care if you're terrified. You pull the trigger, it goes bang. Every single time the mechanism is functioning, it goes bang. That simplicity isn't just a convenience. Under the worst conditions you'll ever face, it's the difference between a gun that fires and a gun that doesn't. Now, I know exactly what's coming next. Revolvers never jam. That's the classic line, and it's not fully true. Revolvers can fail. Debris in the star extractor can lock up the cylinder. Timing issues can develop over time, especially in lightweight alloy frames that take a beating from +P ammunition. Ammunition with high primers can prevent the cylinder from closing. The revolvers never jam line is overstated, and anyone who has shot revolvers extensively knows it. But the direction of the advantage is real. A modern Micro 9 from a reputable manufacturer is remarkably reliable. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But the revolver's reliability advantage isn't about mechanical perfection. It's about gross simplicity under mishandling. It's about how many ways a system can fail when the human operating it is not operating at their best. And the revolver has significantly fewer failure modes that involve the shooter doing something wrong. Here's where the snub nose finally gets its moment. The scenario it was actually built for. Contact distance. Bad breath distance. Someone has their hands on you. You can't create space. You can't get to a holster on your hip because you're being pressed against a wall or you're on the ground. You need something that is already in your hand or can be reached with one motion from a pocket. This is the test the snub nose was designed to pass, and it passes it. Not kind of. Not with caveats. Not, well, technically. It passes it cleanly. At arm's length or closer, pressed against an attacker, possibly with your weak hand occupied or pinned, the snub nose does exactly what it was built to do. You pull the trigger, it fires. You pull it again, it fires again. There is no failure to feed, there is no failure to go into battery, there is no slide lock. There is just trigger, bang, trigger, bang, trigger, bang. Every single time. That is a real advantage. It is not theoretical. It is not hypothetical. It is mechanical, and in that specific context, it matters more than any ballistic gelatin test ever run. If you are ever in a fight at that distance, and that is a real possibility in civilian self-defense, the snub nose gives you something the 9mm compact does not. The confidence that grabbing the gun and pulling the trigger will always produce a shot. Always. No exceptions, no conditions, no unless. That confidence has real value. It might not show up in a gelatin test, but it shows up in the fraction of a second where you either commit to the draw or you don't. The gun works. That was never the question. The question is whether you can make it work. And this is the part that the snub nose's defenders consistently skip. Because the gun passed the deployment test, they assume the argument is over. It isn't. The human bill on this thing is real, and it's the kind of uncomfortable that makes people change the subject. That double-action trigger. Most factory J-frames ship with a trigger pull somewhere between 10 and 14 pounds, depending on the specific model and whether any work has been done to the action. That is heavy. That is heavy in a way that people who mostly shoot striker-fired guns don't intuitively grasp. A Glock trigger is around 5.5 pounds. AP-365 is in a similar range. The difference between 5 pounds and 12 pounds doesn't sound like much on paper until you're trying to fire accurately under stress with a 2-inch barrel and a sight picture. That's basically a suggestion. Think about what 12 pounds actually feels like when you're trying to be precise. Your finger is fighting a heavy spring, while your hands are shaking, and the front sight is wandering, because the gun weighs 11 ounces, and every ounce of that trigger pull is trying to torque the muzzle. Dot off. Target. Documented training outcomes across multiple instructors and departments consistently show that shooters perform worse with heavy double-action triggers than with lighter, striker-fired triggers. And it gets worse. The heavier the trigger pull, the more the act of pulling the trigger itself disturbs the sight alignment on a small, light gun. You're fighting the gun at the exact moment you need it to be most precise. Every pound of that trigger pull is trying to pull the muzzle off target. Then there's the recoil, a lightweight J-frame, and I'm talking about the 11 to 15 ounce aluminum or scandium frame guns that most people actually choose to carry, because steel snubs at 20 plus ounces defeat the purpose of going small. Kicking out 38. Special plus P is not a pleasant experience. It's not unmanageable. Let me be fair about that. People do it. People have done it for decades. But it's sharp, it's fast, and it's the kind of recoil that makes follow-up shots slower and less accurate than they need to be. You're asking a gun that weighs less than a bottle of water to absorb the recoil impulse of a cartridge that was originally designed for a heavier frame. Physics doesn't negotiate. Something has to give, and what gives is your ability to get the second and third and fourth shots on target quickly and accurately. And then there are 5 rounds. 5 rounds sounds completely fine on a Tuesday afternoon when you're standing on a line at 7 yards punching holes in paper with a rested grip. 5 rounds sounds like a different thing entirely when you've already missed twice because your hands are shaking and your heart rate is through the roof and the threat is still moving toward you. 5 rounds minus 2 misses is 3 rounds. 3 rounds is your entire remaining margin for error, and there is no fast reload coming. A speed loader or speed strip exists, sure, but reloading a revolver under stress is a skill that degrades rapidly without constant practice. And most people who carry snub noses don't practice reloads. They practice drawing and firing, which is exactly the right thing to practice for the first 5 rounds. Not fine for anything after that. And if you think you'll just do a New York reload, pull a second gun, you're now talking about carrying 2 guns, which is a solution that proves the first gun's limitation. So here's what we actually have. The snub nose wins the deployment test. It wins the gross motor simplicity test. It wins the contact distance test. It wins the works from inside a pocket test. And then it runs straight into the human limitation test. The gun does its job. The person holding it probably doesn't do theirs well enough. Now let's push this to the extreme, because at contact distance, the snub nose's advantages are real, and I just spent a long time establishing exactly what they are. But what happens when the distance opens up even slightly? Not far, not 25 yards, just 7 to 10 yards. A distance well within documented civilian encounter ranges, but far enough that you actually need to aim, far enough that you have a second to draw properly, far enough that the deployment advantage of the snub nose starts to shrink to almost nothing. At 7 yards, you can draw a micro 9 from an appendix holster and get rounds on target with time to spare. The slide rack problem disappears because you have time and space. The pocket draw advantage disappears because you're not fighting clothing in a desperate grab. Now what matters is trigger quality, recoil control, sight acquisition, and how many rounds you have to work with. And at that distance, with those variables in play, every disadvantage of the snub nose compounds, while every advantage of the 9mm compounds. The lighter trigger lets you shoot more accurately. The lower recoil impulse lets you shoot faster and recover faster. The capacity gives you margin for the misses that happen under stress. The gun that looked like a fair fight at 0 feet starts to look like a clear mismatch at 10. The gap that was debatable at contact distance becomes undeniable at distance. Every single thing the 9mm does better becomes more important, and every single thing the snub nose does worse becomes more costly. At contact distance, the snub nose's deployment advantage can offset its ballistic disadvantage. At 10 yards, there is no deployment advantage to offset anything. You're just standing there with a heavy trigger, a short sight radius, sharp recoil, and 5 rounds. The 9mm has none of those problems. The gap isn't just wider at distance, it's a different kind of gap. At 0 feet, you're comparing 2 different approaches to the same problem. At 10 yards, you're comparing a tool built for one job to a tool built for a job that now looks a lot more like the one you actually face. At 0 feet, the snub nose has an argument. At 10 yards, it just has disadvantages. And that's the real picture. The .38 Special Snub Nose is not a bad gun. It is a specialized tool being judged as if it's a general-purpose defensive sidearm. It was designed for a specific problem, getting rounds on target at contact distance from deep concealment with minimum manipulation. For that problem, it is genuinely good. Not good enough for people who won't carry anything else. Genuinely good. The deployment advantages are real. The simplicity is real. The reliability under gross mishandling is real. But the hate isn't wrong about the rest of it. It's not wrong about the ballistics. It's not wrong about the capacity. It's not wrong about the trigger or the recoil or the fact that most people who carry one can't shoot it as well as they think they can. The hate is just asking the wrong question. It's asking, is this the best defensive handgun? When the real question is this the right tool for this specific person in this specific situation? The 9mm compact is the better general-purpose defensive sidearm. That is not close. If you carry every day, train regularly, and want one gun that handles the widest range of plausible scenarios, get a 9. The capacity, the ballistics, the shootability, the ammunition availability and cost, these aren't small advantages. They're large, and they compound in the situations that matter most. But the snub nose still does something the 9mm doesn't do as well. It disappears in a pocket. It requires zero manipulation to fire. It works at bad breath distance when everything else has gone wrong. For someone who can't or won't carry a larger gun, for someone who carries in environments where a holster isn't practical, for someone who prioritizes always having something over, sometimes having something better, the snub nose isn't a relic. It's a rational choice within a narrow band of real trade-offs. One person chooses the tool that is always ready. Another chooses the tool that is always capable. Both are making a decision about what they're willing to give up. The 38 Special is enough gun. It has been for a long time. The question that actually decides this isn't about the gun anymore. It's about you. Whether you're enough shooter to make 5 rounds of 38 Special count when your hands are shaking and the distance isn't zero, the gun already answered its question. The rest is yours.